If British cinema has a home, it's not Pinewood, it's not Shepperton, it's a slightly manky patch of land in central London, Leicester Square. The movies set up home here almost as soon as they were invented, when Queen Victoria was on the stamps.
But what you wouldn't have seen here in 1896 is a cinema. Cinema, the art form, has been with us for over 11 decades, but cinemas, the places where films live, haven't yet reached their century.
Leicester Square used to be where you found some of Britain's biggest music halls.
When cinema first came to Leicester Square, it was just another novelty act, like people who wrestled alligators. It was a great clattering machine that juggled rolls of celluloid and showed you a view of Venice or of a train leaving a station. But in just a few years, it had caused the demolition of music halls and palaces of varieties. It had sent dancing girls and comics to the Labour Exchange. And soon, cinema was the only show on this square.
The first films were shown anywhere you could put up a few chairs and a big white sheet, not just variety theatres, but empty shops and skating rinks and fairground tents next to the Coconut Shy. By 1910, however, the first cinema buildings were being constructed.
Here, finally, was a bricks and mortar temple to the power of the cinematograph. This was a building that said, movies aren't just a passing fad, like ether sniffing or hooped skirts. Movies are here to stay.
Electric palaces appeared across the country. This one in Harwich was built by an East Anglian travelling showman, Charles Thurston. Before he called in the brickies and plasterers, Harwich folk would probably have caught a film in one of his tents.
Well, it was either that or something morally improving at the Salvation Army Citadel. But if you'd have been here on the opening night of the Electric in 1911, you could have seen an Admiral Nelson double bill. Well, there are a lot of sailors round here, you see.
The builders of the Electric Palace didn't waste their hard-earned cash on extravagances like staircases. A ladder gets the staff up to the projection room. And if you were a film can, you could use the winch on the right. Bricks and mortar cinemas had become a necessity. Indeed, they'd been called for by an Act of Parliament because film was a hazard to public health.
The nitrate, which was a crucial ingredient of early film stock, was terribly flammable. So if somebody chucked a fag butt in a tent, it would have been curtains for everyone. But not if you were projecting films from a room like this.
The booth still has the metal shutters, which were designed to be pulled down if a reel of film became too hot to handle. The auditorium today looks pretty much as it did when people sat here watching Buster Keaton and Felix the Cat. But for many years, it was no more than a derelict shell, until some local enthusiasts came to the rescue with their shovels and their paintbrushes.
It closed in 1956. By 1972, it was in a really sorry state. There was a stench of dead cats. There was water, sort of sodden chairs all over the place. And the first thing that had to be done was to repair the enormous hole in the roof because the rain was just pouring in. I well remember ripping up old floorboards and carting seats out, and we were very fortunate that we had two recently retired plasterers with great skill who could put back the fine plasterwork.
The Palace is now one of the earliest cinemas in the country, still being used for its original purpose.
There's an old story that says that people who worked on the Harwich docks were obliged to enter the cinema via a side entrance so that the patrons in the more expensive seats would remain unmolested by the smell of herrings and bilge. It's apocryphal, of course, but it's certainly true that usherettes would go up and down the aisles here, spraying people with perfumed disinfectant. Edwardian cinema would have been rich with the smell of Jay's fluid, cigarettes and BO.
Films alone wouldn't keep the Palace twinkling today. It's still here simply because the people of Harwich have decided that its presence makes their town a better place to live. It's constantly appealing for money, but then it wasn't very profitable back in the 1920s either. As cinema going became a national obsession, far bigger venues were needed. Venues like this one in South London. No one watches films here now, so it has to turn other tricks to pay its way. But then movies were only ever one of the attractions it offered.
This was once a Granada, part of the cinema chain set up by an Essex boy called Sidney Bernstein. His old dad had built a music hall and some of the first picture palaces, but Sidney had bigger ideas than that. In the 20s, he went to America and came back with a vision of a new kind of cinema, a cinema that offered a total experience. The movies were supposed to transport you to a fantasy world, but what if you were already there from the moment you walked into the foyer?
And so, a mock Gothic Spanish cathedral came to be designed by a former director of the Bolshoi Ballet, crafted by Italian artisans and deposited on Tooting High Street. No dingy corridors at the Granada. Instead, the circle is reached through a hall of mirrors. Here, they could seat over 3,000 people for 3 shows a day, Monday through Sunday. That's up to 63,000 bums on seats a week. And they needed cheering up. It was the 1930s. There was a depression on, a great one.
You were sort of transported as soon as you came through the door. You're in another world. My mother always knew if I'd been to the cinema because I was always very humpy when I came home. She said, "You've been to the pictures, haven't you?" I said, "Yeah." Because I'd come out of there, that beautiful world, and I'd come home to humdrum, steamy washing around the fire.
Oh, it was gorgeous. It was packed. It was packed.
So who came here? Who visited here? What stars came here when it was a cinema?
John Wayne came. Jane Mansfield came. Eddie Fisher came. Elsie and Doris Waters.
What do you remember about Jane Mansfield?
Oh, the figure. Beautiful. She was beautiful. I was more excited about Tyrone Power. It was handsome, he was. He stood on the balcony outside, and the crowds were all outside shouting for him, you know. And at the time when Neighbour was here, I was usherette, and we used to have to stand on the steps there and be looked at every day before we went on parade. We were very smart, very smart. We had blue trousers, a gold blouse with 3 gold and blue buttons, and a cape, and the hat we used to have on the side like a sailor's hat.
It's a complete replica of the Alhambra Palace in Granada. And I always said that if I ever got the chance to go to Granada in Spain, I would. And I did go there. And I think actually that the Granada in Spain came off second best to this.
The Tooting Granada even had a resident 20-piece orchestra, and since it looked like a church, they stuck a dirty great organ in it. In the early 70s, this mightiest of mighty Wurlitzers was flooded with sewage, then entombed under the bingo caller's tank of skittering balls. But in an underground lair, an enthusiast has been trying to give it the kiss of life.
The sound of the organ, of course, it's not an electronic instrument, this is a pipe organ. And
So where are the pipes?
Standing right behind you, you'll see a series of what we call shutters, and these open and close, and you can just about see a few pipes inside.
Oh, right, okay. I can see hundreds of them. It looks like, how many are behind there?
Oh, there's over 1,500 pipes, something like that. Many people asked, will it ever play again into the theatre? Will the console ever come up from the depths? With any luck, we might just be able to get it through the floor for the first time in 33 years while you're here. So
Fantastic.
If you're prepared to take the chance...
Does that mean I can have a ride?
Any time you like.
Let's go.
As I sensed Len's organ rising beneath me, I knew I was privileged to be among the first to have a go on it.
That's fantastic. So listen, when audiences were coming here to hear the organ played, it was part of a big live show, wasn't it?
Well, in the very early days, they were used for silent picture accompaniment. You know, they took the place of cinema pianists and indeed orchestras at times. You know, once Al Johnson came in and the sound movies came in, the organ then took on the role of being a solo instrument during the ice cream interval and playing a march to march everybody out.
So what happened to them all then? Because this is quite a rare survival, this, isn't it?
Well, come the sort of 1960s, 70s, their era was truly over and cinemas were being changed in their format, and they became redundant. The theatre organists were laid off and they were largely put to bed, mothballed, you might say.
By the 1950s, not even whopping great pipes and cod Gothic spandrels could compete with the new rival to film.
Television didn't offer you opulence, but it did offer you entertainment without the obligation of getting off your bottom. Sidney Bernstein saw what was coming, and he turned Granada into a television company. He wasn't sentimental about cinema, and he certainly wasn't sentimental about money, and by 1973, this place wasn't making any. He decided to call in the wrecking balls and flog the land.
At the last minute, though, the building was saved by being listed. It's the only cinema in Britain to be rated Grade 1. It's as protected from the bulldozers as St Paul's Cathedral. And soon after, the Tooting Granada experienced a resurrection, thanks to the same saviour that offered life after death to many other old cinemas.
7 and 2, 72. 1 and 5, 15. 8 and 4, 84.
Until 1960, bingo was what you did at Butlins when it was too wet for a glamorous grandmother competition by the Olympic-sized swimming pool.
3, 7, 37.
But then it was legalised as a commercial activity, and clickety-click, just 7 years later, bingo halls were receiving 260 million annual admissions, already 10 million more than were turning up at the Flickers.
So what kind of chat do you use then? What about the two fat ladies and the clickety
Not
click
allowed
and all
anymore. Completely outlawed.
Not allowed? Outlawed?
It's not PC.
By
is
whom?
it? It's not PC, is it? Two fat ladies.
Clickety click, there's nothing un-PC about
Clickety
clickety click,
click.
isn't there? You need to show me how it's done now. Okay, so you just press the green button and it all starts up.
Yep,
Am
press
I
green
allowed?
button. Yep.
6 and 8. 68.
That's
that
so
good? Was
that's
that
so cheesy.
Was that a bit old school?
That was like Wesley Balls.
Now,
Droopy drawers.
44. Droopy drawers. F44. 46. On its own, 9.
I could get into this, but I'm not sure it'd be a good long-term career move.
89.
Attendance at bingo clubs has been falling for years. It's more than halved since the mid-1970s.
So bingo is facing the same kind of crisis that the movies faced in the 60s and 70s. But just as they did when cinema audiences collapsed, these buildings will survive. The question is, who will their next occupants be? Who's going to be having fun here in 50 years' time?
8 and 4, 84. 7 and 1, 71.
There's even talk of running a few movie screenings here again. Maybe things are about to turn full circle at the Tooting Granada. But elsewhere, there are signs of another possible future for film.
As cinemas turned into bingo halls and flats and shops and pubs and clubs, films have had to look for new homes elsewhere. Mainly, they moved in with us in the form of video and DVD. And we've been pretty happy together, haven't we?
In the early days, when they'd set up home together, film and cinemas seemed as inseparable as guys and dolls. Since then, they've learned to live more independent lives. That's not a twist many people saw coming, but it's still a sort of happy ending.
Well, next up, latest Channel 4 news. 1:45 today, Alistair Sim stars in the film comedy Green for Danger, Tears of Laughter. I promise you.
The thrill of the organ, the smell of the popcorn, the eager anticipation of the feature presentation. If you head to the movies in the UK, there's a 1 in 3 chance you'll end up here. Well, not specifically here, but in a building like this. From humble Brummie beginnings, Odeon's gone on to be the home of British cinema going for 4 generations. So sit back, tell the woman next to you to pipe down, grab your popcorn, and enjoy the rags to riches story of Odeon. I'm here outside what the Hollywood elite call the Cathedral. It's seen them all, this place. Serena McKellen, Bubble from Big Brother. Tom Cruise was here 3 years ago for a walkabout and he's still here now. But despite the glitz and glamour of Odeon's flagship cinema, the origins lie far away from London's glittering West End. Our story starts in 1930 when pioneering entrepreneur Oscar Deutsch opened the first Odeon in Birmingham. But Oscar's origins weren't quite as glamorous as his future venture.
My father was born in 1893 in Birmingham. He was an only child, and he eventually went into his own father's scrap metal business and did quite well there. And that formed a basis of security to go into the movie industry.
The first Odeon was actually at Perry Bar. It was originally going to be called the Picture House, but as it happened, there was another cinema of the same name in the area, Deutsch, and his fellow directors had to come up with something else.
Odeon is the name for an amphitheatre at the Acropolis near Athens, and fortunately, he could actually find a nice acronym for it. Oscar Deutsch entertains our nation.
These new Odeons really pushed the existing cinemas into a second-run category. That they became the flea pits when these new buildings appeared.
While these new buildings might have been luxurious, Oscar wasn't 100% happy with their design. And so, in 1934, as he prepared for a new, ambitious project in his hometown, Oscar approached friend and neighbour Harry Whedon, an architect who oversaw the vast majority of subsequent Odeon cinema buildings, including the flagship in Leicester Square. The architecture itself was Odeon's marketing. It was the best advertising money could buy because it was there every day in bricks and mortar. And with me, Ron Wild, who I've met today, who knew the original architect.
That's correct, yes. I did know Harry very well.
Harry Whedon.
Harry Whedon, that's right.
What did he do for Odeon?
Harry was a great innovator. Previously to this, cinemas were in old garages, agricultural halls and so on. And what he wanted to do was to create an image that could be immediately recognised by when you're driving down the street, you would recognise this particular feature. And most of the cinemas had a vertical tower. And of course, there would be a very large canopy in front of the cinema. So you had a vertical feature and a horizontal feature.
In what way, then, did this building make the Odeon brand?
I think it was probably a combination of many things. The building certainly contributed towards it, but Lily, that's Oscar's wife, had a big impact in what materials were used inside. She was quite keen on colours and fabrics and that sort of thing, and she was involved in most of the Odeon cinemas throughout the building programme in the 30s.
How much does Odeon today owe to the buildings that it first had?
Oh, I think they does owe a lot to the original concept, and I think it's a link with the past into the future.
Are you proud to have known Harry
Yes,
Whedon?
I am very proud of him. He was an extremely nice man.
Whedon's sleek, stylish Art Deco creations embodied the spirit of the times and brought a touch of Hollywood glamour to often drab and depressed urban areas. 7 decades on, their glamour hasn't faded, and many are now listed buildings and part and parcel of Odeon's enduring appeal. The thing about the Odeon was that it wasn't just a place to go and see a movie. It was a place where people from all walks of life could go escape the daily grind, and enjoy a bit of escapism.
People were now starting to suffer from unemployment, all kinds of things that were affecting our social society.
Here was a place in the town that had luxury. It was a picture palace. There was nothing like it. There were lots of other cinemas, some of the Granada circuit, ABC circuit, Gaumont British circuit. Very big, very charming, but none of them as luxurious.
And there are stories, particularly in poorer areas, of people going in and walking on carpet for the first time and being amazed at the fittings in the toilets and all this kind of thing, and even staying there all day just to keep warm.
This was a place where they could go to and forget their sadness.
Odeons weren't just a source of entertainment, they were a source of employment. During the 1930s, coming out of a harsh depression, they were one of the few industries that was booming. Building on Glasgow's Renfield Street, for example, was like taking a darkened room and flooding it with light.
My father provided building work which was so scarce for hundreds, maybe thousands of people.
Until war stopped things in 1939, they opened 138 completely new cinemas and took over almost as many and applied the Odeon name to them as well.
At one time, they were building 2 Odeons a week. This went on for about 4 or 5 years. So that's a massive, massive building program.
Now, it wasn't really just about employment, nor was it just about rampant escapism, and it wasn't just about action on the screen. Odeon, for generations, was about action on the love seat as well. Oh, give her a kiss. Go on.
The back rows of the stalls were always two-seaters. And this is another advantage, of course, of the cinema, that it was a great place to take your girlfriend and have a bit of time alone.
It was a sort of very affordable way of going out and getting away from the parents and into a dark environment where you could get up to a certain amount, but the usherettes kept an eye on things.
They used to shine the torches along the roads to see nothing was going on that shouldn't be going on.
As war broke out, the Odeon cinemas became both a refuge and a target.
Cinemas were considered safe havens, basically. If there's an air raid, you had the choice of staying and watching the show or leaving. These are very strong buildings and probably the safest place to be above ground.
During the war, it wasn't an Odeon cinema, it was a private independent cinema that I was actually in when a rocket exploded above and a huge cylinder, like an oxygen cylinder, came through the roof and landed right in the gangway of a packed cinema.
A few Odeons that were struck, most notably one in Kemp Town, where a bomb fell in the front stalls on a Saturday afternoon, where many children, unfortunately, were there. In total, about 55 people were killed during that incident. But Odeons also had a role, like other cinemas, through bringing war news onto the screen. And of course, there's always a chance you might see somebody you knew rolling around in a tank in Africa or somewhere else.
I remember on the newsreel, I was sitting there and my brother was in Burma in the army, and it was showing you their like tanks, I don't know what they called them, going over the water into land, and my brother was on it. I left the cinema to run home and tell me mum.
In spite of the bombings and the hardship, the war had been a boom time for cinema, with a distinct duopoly emerging, Odeon and long-time rival ABC. But having weathered the war, both now had to face a new and deadlier enemy.
In 1946, people were going to the cinema on average once a week in Britain, and then by 40 years later, that had gone down to once a year, so it had gone down to a 50th. And in that time, of course, the big thing that happened is television.
The Odeon circuit began to suffer from the effects of television, particularly the arrival of ITV, which was deliberately more popular in its programming than the BBC had been.
So what they started doing was closing them down, turning them into bingo halls, turning them into dance halls. Their cinema portfolio went down from several hundred in the 1940s to something like 75 by the mid-80s.
In the 1970s, there was something of a turning point, really, with the arrival of blockbusters like Jaws and Star Wars. And then a few years later, as more and more homes started installing those natty VHS video players, the passion for cinema going itself was reignited.
What video did was it educated a whole new generation of film fans. It turned people into, millions and millions of young people into real film fans.
But just as Odeon was finding its feet, it was caught off guard by a cinematic revolution.
The turning point for cinema in Britain really happened in 1985, the opening of the very first multiplex in the UK, The Point, in Milton Keynes. And that was, I guess, initially seen as a bit of a threat.
Odeon traditionally had been 2, 3, 4 screen cinemas in core city centre locations, and Odeon had to make some very, very difficult decisions very quickly.
The general strategy has been, if you can't beat 'em, join 'em. While it draws a lot of its identity and success from its glorious heritage, Odeon's also realised that a new generation of moviegoers loves the multiplex and has even gone as far as gobbling up a multiplex chain in the form of UCI as well as arch-rival ABC. But it still has some pretty stiff competition to see off.
Odeon's chief rivals today are the View Cinemas and also Cineworld, and to a lesser degree Showcase. What's been very interesting over the last, I guess, 20 years with the huge multiplex boom is there's been this bewildering flurry of different brand names coming and going. Throughout all that time, Odeon has always been there like this kind of beacon, a beacon of heritage.
So despite the Nazis, TV and the multiplexes, Odeon still remains the dominant name in British cinema going. So just what is it about the Odeon that keeps us Brits coming back for more?
We've had 75 years of heritage and high street presence in Britain. Many people have grown up with cinema. Odeon is considered to be synonymous with cinema for so many people.
In the case of Odeon, it's about being there. It's about being on the high street. It's about people going there, having a great experience, enjoying themselves, remembering that experience and coming back for more. That then makes the brand imprinted on their mind and they want more and more of it. They are the strongest brand out there on the market. Odeon is the #1 iconic cinematic brand.
Spy Antics with Tom Hanks at 1:40 and the man with one red shoe. And before that, at 12:35, it's Sussex versus the Dordogne for A Place in the Sun.
At a very early age, I was interested in cinemas, not just for the films, but the whole atmosphere, a sense of occasion going to the cinema. And for ages, I'd pestered my mother to take me to the Ritz, because in those days, this was 1940, all over Merseyside, you'd see posters advertising the Ritz, Birkenhead, showplace of the North. So I couldn't wait to get there. And eventually my mother took me on one sunny summer's afternoon in July 1940. Now, the moment you arrived at the Ritz and stepped over the threshold, you were aware that this wasn't just another cinema. This was the cinema. The thick carpets, the mirrored foyer, it was all so magnificent. And then when you went into the theatre itself, the main feature film was preceded by several sets of curtains opening. And on the screen came in big letters the words, "The Ritz presents," accompanied by a suitable fanfare. The curtains opened to reveal a fully dressed stage with scenery. The only time I've actually seen this in a cinema. And it was a beautiful cloud sequence. And the only thing missing was Fred